academic writing, students are usually taught to go for one particular perspective for a majority of their writings. And that way usually involves quotations, citations, and academic research. That's what most of our students know. They are taught to find good quotes, good research, and to use that to use in their arguments of different kinds. And so usually they're encouraged to go to primary sources, or if not those, then good secondary sources, to find authors and sources that have authority on a given topic and to use those in a way to incorporate into their own argument to then present their paper. That's all well and good. But there is a second way of going about writing, a way that often isn't seen so much anymore, but still is very powerful, because it does a lot of things for the writer as well as for the reader. And that's writing out of original thought, out of your perspective, not relying on the opinions of others or the research done before, but giving your own account of something and letting others take it for what it's worth. You see, I think in a similar way, as Christians, we often do the first more than the second. We're very good at quoting what others have said, what the Bible says, what other pastors, preachers, teachers, or colleagues have said. But sometimes when we're asked a question of what we believe, it catches us off guard. We haven't thought about it before. Maybe we're just not used to articulating it as such. But it's a good thing to stop and pause and say what we believe. Because at different times, especially difficult ones, it's what we personally believe that holds us through the situation and enables us to keep on going. And above all, we worship a personal God who wants to know us and what we have to say. So let us take a look and explore the great depths of our personal God and our personal faith. In our first lesson, Jesus is taking his disciples away for some teaching. He did this quite often, usually after some great ministry. And that's exactly where we find Jesus and his disciples at the beginning of this lesson. He's taking them away to the region of Caesarea Philippi. And here he wants to give them a couple questions and to see what their answer is. And so he starts off by saying, "Who do people say that I am?" And so the disciples probably sit there and think and then respond, saying, "Well, some say you're John the Baptist, this great man who is helping prepare the way for the Christ. Others say that you're Elijah, this man who is believed to come back and help usher in the end times before the Messiah arrives. But still others say you're Jeremiah or one of the other great prophets." Jesus seems pretty content with that, but then has another question for them. This one's a lot more personal. He says, "What about you? Who do you say I am?" You know how sometimes when you get to a section like that, it's not written, but you can tell there's a pause? All of a sudden, that question just makes you stop and think. You have to change gears because you went from reporting information to now having to articulate something. Think about it. When you're with your good friends and you're having a lively discussion and they ask you a similar question, "Hey, what do you think?" You take a moment because you have to change gears. And so Simon Peter, probably the one of the most vocal disciples, decides to give his answer. He says, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Now see, as Christians that have access to the fullness of this Bible, we're used to hearing such confessions. But in its setting, Peter is giving something so genuine because it hasn't been spoken of all that much before. He says, "You're the Messiah, the one who is going to come and redeem us, the one who God promised to our ancestors and is now here." He said, "You're that one." The next thing he says, "You are the Son of the living God." You have to understand, it was that particular thing that upset every other Jewish person there, because it was considered blasphemous. Because they believed in the one true God, and to say that there is something else now, the Son of the living God, could have been blasphemous. Peter could have been stoned if he said that aloud to too many people. But being asked by Jesus what his true opinion was, he said, "Yeah, you're the Messiah, and I believe you're the Son of the living God." To that Jesus replied that on this foundation I will build my church, and not even death will overcome it. There's some power in that statement. Because Jesus is saying, on this foundation, this personal confession of who I am, I will build my church. But it's the next thing that also catches my eye, that not even death will overcome it, which to me says something. Because it means that something will try to overcome it, it just won't succeed. It should be alarming to us all. Because it means that our convictions will be tested. But if we stay our ground, it won't overcome us. As many of you know, I was recently on vacation. Kim and I enjoyed some sun and some waves down at the shore. And it's one of those minor little observations you pick up on. But when you're in the ocean, you get tossed around by the waves, right? It's fun. It's partially what you go down there for. And isn't it great? You know, you're out there swimming, all of a sudden that wave just knocks you over. You didn't see it coming. And you get tossed head over tin cups. And off you go. But it's different when you see the wave coming. You can plant your feet down and brace for that wave. And you don't get moved as much, right? Maybe a little bit. Maybe not so much. It's a similar way. When we brace ourselves with our convictions when trouble comes, we can stay our ground a bit more than if we didn't. And surely there are some things that we believe in that we don't particularly hold too fast to. It's a bit more malleable. There's some things that we say, I'm willing to sit there and have a discussion about. And there are other things that we say, I'm pretty convinced of this, so I won't be moved. Peter certainly had something he put his foot down. He knew who Jesus was, and he wanted to articulate it as such. It's that very question of who Christ is to us that continues to be asked over and over again. Who is Jesus to us? And what does that do? How does it shape us? You see, when we identify who Jesus is, sometimes it gets us into a bit of trouble. That's where we find Paul in his second letter. You see, Paul was a great evangelist, missionary, preacher, teacher, among other things. He also tended to be a good tanner. That was his trade. And Paul wrote many letters to various churches. He would go to a particular place, build up a body of believers, and when they were able to be self-sufficient, he would go to another place and do the exact same thing, and would often write letters of encouragement, which is what we find. The letters to the Corinthians, Thessalonians, Galatians, Ephesians, as well as letters to people he was working with in ministry, letters to Timothy, to others. But you see, Romans is different. The conditions it was written under are very different from the others. Does anybody know how this letter is written? What are the conditions Paul's written?
It's a letter of introduction.
It's a letter of introduction.
He's planning to visit Rome, a church he hadn't been to.
Exactly. This letter is different in many ways. Primarily because Paul is also writing this under different terms. He's not a free man at this time. He's in prison. If you read up on Acts, you know that Paul eventually, there's a plot to kill him, and through a series of events, he petitions to go before the emperor, using his right as a Roman citizen. And here, when Paul is talking about persecution, he knows what that's like. He's been through shipwrecks. He's been thrown out of cities. He's been stoned, but survived it. He's been in a bit of trouble. And so when we get to this section, he has just finished talking about the glory of God. And so he goes through this little course, saying, if God is for us, who can be against us? He says, certainly not God, explaining not only to himself but to others, saying, certainly not God, because he offered up his son for us. So why would he ever withhold anything else? He says, who would accuse God's people? Again, certainly not God, because he gave us his son. Likewise not Christ, because he died for us and then was raised to life so that we could be redeemed. But it's this next part that gets me. It says, who? In other translations, what? Who or what can separate hardship, or persecution, or hunger, or poverty, or danger, or even death. His response was no. None of these things. And when I read this, it's the word in verse 38 that gets me. He said, I'm convinced that nothing can separate us from the love of God. You see, he wasn't persuaded. He wasn't coerced into believing. He wasn't just hopefully assuming that these things would be true. He was convinced. He had weighed it out. He had thought about it. He had considered his options, and he said, I'm convinced that in light of anything out there, nothing in this world can separate us from the love of God. You see, convictions hold you when times get tough. Whether you're starting out with something new or going through trouble that seems to keep on popping up, convictions hold fast. And for Paul, a conviction in his faith gets him through everything. It's what's going to keep him there. And he's considered it. Again, as a man who's seen his fair share of trouble in his life in the name of God, I think we could take something from that. Because he's weighed this out himself. He's convinced of it. Because of nobody else but his own experience. Because what he has seen in God. When I was finishing up seminary, we had a similar course in this very topic. You see, much like I had said in the beginning, we were schooled into finding good resources, good quotes, and being able to incorporate that into our academic writing. And all of a sudden, they threw us a curveball. In our final semester, there was a course that said, you can leave all that at the door. Now we're going to ask you for your own thoughts. So we're going to ask you, what do you believe about God? About Jesus, about the Holy Spirit, about the church, about ministry, about the sacraments, about worship. Oh, and by the way, you can't quote anything, not even the Bible. It sounds like a tall order, right? And indeed it was. The whole focus for that entire semester was you're going to write one lengthy paper about each of these topics, incorporating what you believe about each. And again, it's what you believe. And as students that have been versed for possibly 3, 4, 5, 6 years in academic writing in the way that the seminary taught us, this was really weird and really difficult. All of a sudden, we couldn't go to the resources we loved. We couldn't sit there and call through our Bibles that had notes and everything. We said, no, what do you believe? And why? Again, don't quote somebody else. Tell me why in your faith you believe in Jesus. What do you believe about? Who is he? Man, that was something else. Because we hadn't been used to it. But it really was a good discipline. And a good exercise. And so draft after draft, I sat there and wrote something, crumpled it up, and threw it away. And then went back and picked up the pieces and tried to figure out what it was. Because even though I knew God, being asked what I personally believe at the end of the day was a very personal, was a very dangerous, was a very open thing. That I was now going to give what I truly believed in my heart of hearts for somebody else to look at and read. But in the end, it gave me some beautiful things to think about. And I'll just share one of those with you. You often probably have heard me say it. I write it into the prayers quite often. I talk about the living God. It's something that stayed with me from my youth to present day, but it's evolved in different ways. As a young child, growing up in a Christian family, I knew who God was. But there was one thing that always scared me, and that was death. I didn't know as a child what that was like. I mean, I knew existence, my eyes were open, and this was life. To think about closing them and not seeing something else was terrifying. But when Sunday school teachers, my parents, my church family talked about a God who would give you life again, that was encouraging. And so all of a sudden, that name, we worship the living God, meant something. And then as I grew older, realizing what that meant through Jesus Christ. And then as I got even older and got into my 20s, saying, the living God, the one who is working in our world. He's not just waiting for something to happen at the end of life, but does things that impacts this world. That he fights against things that hurt, things that damage, things that wound us in this age, not just waiting, but does it now. So that's the living God, the one who does battle against evil in this age. That's who God was to me. Jesus came and gave us life, not just in the life to come, but right here. New purpose, new things. And so I was willing to stand my ground on that, as I wrote those pages. But again, it was that challenge of who God was to me. Going back to that very question that Jesus asked of his disciples. Who do you say I am? You've probably heard it said that sometimes we're the only Bible people read. So who is Jesus to us? It's a question worth asking and thinking about, not just now in the moment, but continually, through each day. Because that answer will likely change at various points in our lives. Who is God to us may not be the same in our 20s as it will be in our 40s or 60s. Because God changes who we know God to be changes. He is a personal God and therefore will change and will be different for us from each age. And certainly some things stay the same and end up being that rock that we stand on. But it's good if we know God in different ways. So my prayer for you today is to think about those things. Think about your convictions in the Lord. And answer that question from time to time. Give it some good thought. Who is God to you? And answer it justly. And be honest. Because I'm sure that God will meet you. And will let those things be something you can stand in.